By the fourth afternoon of the heat wave, the young peach orchard looked as though the sun had been pressing down on it with both hands. The air above the rows shimmered. Leaves curled inward along their edges, and the metal handles of pruning tools became too hot to hold comfortably. 14-year-old Mason Reed walked beside his father through the lowest block, checking the smooth trunks of trees planted only a few seasons earlier. Daniel stopped beside an untreated peach tree and touched the southwest side of its trunk. The bark was painfully hot. A narrow vertical line had appeared beneath one branch. At first it looked like an ordinary scratch, but when Daniel pressed gently near it, the outer bark shifted away from the tissue below. A few rows over, the lower trunks of Mason's experimental trees were painted white. They looked strange beneath the green canopies, like fence posts growing peaches. Mason placed a surface thermometer against one of them and compared it with the dark bark of an untreated tree. The white trunk was cooler, but a temperature reading could not reveal whether the living tissue underneath had survived. The real answer would appear after the heat ended. If you enjoy quiet farm stories about practical ideas, honest mistakes, and people who notice what others overlook, subscribe and join us. Sometimes protecting a harvest begins with changing nothing more than the color of a surface. 3 weeks earlier, Mason had entered the orchard carrying a bucket, a wide brush, and a wooden stirring stick. He began coating the lower trunks of selected young peach trees with a thin white mixture designed for orchard bark. He worked from the base of each trunk to the first major branches, brushing carefully around rough spots without covering leaves or green shoots. Claire Reed stopped beside the row and stared at him. "Are you painting trees or building a fence?" Several neighboring workers noticed from the road. They pointed at Mason and laughed. One said the Reed family had started growing white posts instead of peaches. Another asked whether Mason planned to paint the leaves next. Mason kept a modest, thoughtful expression and continued working. Daniel did not laugh, but he was cautious. The mixture could wash away, hide insect holes, trap moisture if applied too thickly, or damage tender growth if Mason used it carelessly. Mason did not coat the entire orchard. He selected one experimental block, left nearby young trees untreated, and marked several trunks for temperature comparison. He was not trying to make the orchard look cleaner. He was trying to send part of the afternoon sunlight back into the air before the bark could turn it into dangerous heat. The Reed family's young peach block stood on open ground in Yakima County, Washington. There were no tall windbreaks or mature trees close enough to shade the trunks during the hottest part of the afternoon. The young peaches received direct sun from midday until evening, especially along their southwest sides. Older trees had thicker, rougher bark. Their trunks had endured many seasons of wind, cold, and sunlight. The younger trees were more exposed. Their bark remained smoother and thinner, and their limited canopies did not always cast enough shade on their own trunks. Walter Reed showed Mason an old tree near the boundary fence. Years earlier, its bark had cracked after a period of intense summer heat. The injury had not killed the tree immediately. Instead, one side had weakened gradually. The damaged area healed poorly, insects entered the rough edges, and a major branch above it never grew as strongly as the others. "The air does not have to feel like fire," Walter said. "The bark only has to absorb more heat than the tissue beneath it can tolerate." Mason began comparing air temperature with surface temperature. On sunny afternoons, the dark natural bark often became much hotter than the surrounding air. The sun was not heating every object equally. Darker surfaces absorbed more of the incoming energy, while lighter ones reflected a larger share. Mason created a simple test beside the workshop. He placed 2 similar wooden posts in full sunlight. One remained dark and weathered. He coated the other with the same white orchard mixture he planned to use on the peach trunks. By early afternoon, the dark post felt much hotter. After sunset, the difference faded quickly. The white coating did not create cold or cool the wood from within. It simply reduced how much solar energy the surface absorbed during the day. Mason designed 3 orchard groups. Some young trees remained untreated. Others received a very thin, uneven coat. The final group received a smooth, consistent layer after the bark had been cleaned and inspected. He also left several mature trees unpainted as a separate comparison. Their thicker bark might respond differently from the young trunks. Daniel watched Mason attach small surface sensors to the southwest sides. "What exactly are you trying to learn?" he asked. Where the white bark stays cooler, Mason said, and where the cooler bark is actually less damaged. That second question mattered more. A lower temperature meant little unless the living tissue beneath the surface remained healthier. Mason's first application looked bad before the weather became dangerous. He mixed one batch too thin and brushed it directly over dusty bark. The liquid ran downward in pale streaks, leaving dark gaps between them. After a brief rain, much of the coating washed onto the soil. On several other trees, he made the opposite mistake. He applied a heavy coat in one pass, believing that more protection would reflect more sunlight. As the mixture dried, the surface cracked into small plates. Some sections lifted away from the trunk, and moisture remained trapped beneath the loose edges. Claire touched one flaking patch. It looks like the tree is peeling paint from an old barn. Mason also splashed the mixture onto a few leaves and tender green shoots. Daniel made him rinse them immediately. The trunk is the experiment, his father said, not the entire tree. A more serious concern appeared during inspection. On one young peach, the white layer covered a tiny hole near the base of a branch. Daniel scraped the coating away and found signs that the bark needed closer examination. Painting over an injury did not repair it. It only made the injury harder to see. Daniel told Mason that a coated trunk could look protected while hiding a problem underneath. Mason agreed. He removed every loose or badly applied section with a soft brush. Before painting again, he cleaned dust from each trunk and allowed the bark to dry. Any crack, hole, dark patch, or suspicious wound was inspected before it received a coating. He changed his technique as well. Instead of one thick layer, Mason applied several light passes. He kept the mixture off the leaves and young shoots. Around rough areas, he used a smaller brush so he could see what he was covering. On a few trees, he left narrow sections of natural bark exposed beside the white coating. This allowed him to compare temperatures on the same trunk. After the next sunny afternoon, the measurements became more consistent. The evenly coated surfaces stayed cooler than the untreated bark. The extremely thin coat produced a smaller difference. The trees where rain had removed most of the mixture heated almost as quickly as the controls. The method was beginning to make sense. It still required maintenance, careful inspection, and correct application. The workers along the road continued pointing toward the white trunks and laughing. Mason ignored them. He had learned that a useful protection could not merely look bright from a distance. It had to remain attached, allow inspection, and survive the weather long enough to matter. Then the forecast changed. The heat wave arrived in the middle of July. Clear skies settled over the valley. Wind weakened during the afternoon, and each day became hotter than the one before. The soil dried quickly between irrigations, and the young peach leaves began showing stress before noon. Daniel checked the drip lines twice. White bark could not protect a tree whose roots had no water. The coating affected only the surface of the trunk. It could not cool the soil, prevent fruit sunburn, or replace irrigation. Mason refreshed the coating on several trees where rain had thinned it. Then he checked the temperature sensors and marked the southwest side of every control trunk. During the first hot afternoon, the untreated bark warmed faster. By early afternoon, the dark trunks were noticeably hotter than the white ones. The difference was greatest where the sun struck directly and remained for several hours. On the second day, every young tree looked stressed. Leaves drooped slightly during the worst heat. Some fruit on exposed branches developed pale sunken patches. The white mixture did nothing to stop those problems. Its job was narrower. It was meant to reduce heating on the trunk. By the third afternoon, the first visible injury appeared in the control group. The bark on two young trees became dull and slightly sunken along the southwest side. Another trunk developed a narrow vertical split. The painted group was not untouched. One tree whose coating had washed away before Mason restored it developed a small damaged patch. Another remained cool at the trunk but suffered badly because its irrigation emitter had become partly blocked. That failure mattered. A white surface could not compensate for dry roots. The fourth day became the hottest. Mason and Daniel moved through the orchard with water, tools, and notebooks. They compared surface temperatures and inspected the bark without celebrating the readings. The sensors showed that the white trunks remained cooler. But that was only the immediate effect. The important question was whether the living layer beneath the bark had avoided lasting injury. As the sun dropped behind the hills, the orchard finally began to cool. Several untreated trunks still radiated warmth into the evening. The white ones lost their small amount of stored heat more quickly. Mason stood between the rows and looked at the thin cracks on the control trees. He had not stopped the heat wave. He had only changed how much of its energy the young bark had been forced to hold. The full damage became clearer after the weather cooled. On several untreated young trees, the southwest side of the trunk developed long, narrow cracks. Some bark darkened and began separating from the living tissue underneath. One damaged area widened enough for Daniel to remove a loose edge and inspect the injury. Not every untreated tree suffered. A few stood in slightly better positions, received more afternoon shade from their own branches, or had already developed somewhat thicker bark. Good irrigation also helped them endure the heat. The experiment did not produce a perfect line between damaged brown trunks and healthy white ones. But the pattern was still visible. In the properly coated group, most trunks remained intact. The white layer did not make the fruit larger. It did not prevent leaves from wilting. It did not protect exposed peaches from sunburn. It reduced overheating on one vulnerable part of the young tree. There were failures there too. The tree with the blocked irrigation line remained weak despite its cool trunk. Another had a small burn where rain had removed part of the coating. A badly applied section began flaking and had to be cleaned away. Daniel recorded those cases instead of excluding them. A method was not trustworthy if it counted only its best results. Calvin Brooks, the neighbor who had once joked about the Reed family growing black barrels, visited after the heat wave. He walked past the white trunks without laughing. Daniel showed him a cracked control tree first. Then they moved to a nearby coated trunk of the same age. Calvin placed his hand against the smooth white surface. "What did you use on these?" Mason did not simply point toward the bucket. He showed Calvin the tree where the coating had been applied too thickly. He explained that not every white material was suitable for living bark. The trunk had to be inspected first, the mixture had to be appropriate for orchard use, and the layer had to remain thin and even. The coating also needed maintenance after rain. It did not replace irrigation, shade, mulch, or proper tree care. Mature trunks might not require the same protection, and local conditions could change the result. The following summer, the Reeds did not paint every tree. They treated the youngest peaches on the most exposed ground and continued leaving a small control group. Daniel checked each trunk before Mason applied the coating. Claire still said the lower orchard looked like a row of white fence posts. But this time, Daniel carried the second brush. Mason had not cooled the valley or weakened the summer sun. He had simply kept young dark bark from absorbing every bit of heat the afternoon offered. And during one brutal week in July, sending a little sunlight back into the sky was enough to keep several trunks from turning that light into a wound.